In September of 2022, I saw a photograph on a phone screen that I was not supposed to see. My friend Janet was showing me pictures from her summer, scrolling too fast to stop in time, and there it was, 12 people at the trailhead above Copper Lake. The same trailhead where I had stood with most of those same people every Labor Day weekend for 22 years. They had gone without me. They had not told me they were going. They had not asked if I wanted to come, or if I wanted to meet them at the bottom for dinner, or if I wanted to know the trip was happening at all. They had simply reorganized around my absence the way water reorganizes around a stone, and gone. I had a knee replacement in April of 2021. I walk carefully now. I no longer hike. These are the facts of the matter. What I did not know before that photograph was that these facts made me invisible to a group of people I had called my closest friends for 2 decades. I'm 85 years old. I have been thinking about that photograph for 3 years now. Not with bitterness. I have moved through the bitterness and come out the other side, but with the specific clarity that comes from understanding something about your own life that you spent decades not examining. My social world was built around what I did, around the pace I kept, around the version of me that was always in motion. And when the motion changed, most of the world that had formed around it changed with it. What I found in the slowness was not what I expected. I want to tell you what it was. You need to understand what kind of person I was, because the kind of person I was is exactly why what happened, happened. I taught geography for 30 years at the high school 3 miles from where I live now. Geography was not an accident. I chose it because it was the subject that required you to understand the world by moving through it. I went to places. I took students to places. I believed, with the convert's fervor of someone who discovered something young and never stopped believing it, that the best way to know something was to stand in front of it. Martin and I married in 1963, and we were, for 54 years, the people in our circle who were always going somewhere. Every summer a trip, not always far, not always expensive, but always somewhere we hadn't been. The Scottish Highlands in 1979, when the children were young enough that it was genuinely difficult, and we did it anyway. Costa Rica in 1994. The year we drove the entire length of Highway 1 and stopped whenever something looked interesting, which meant we took 4 days to cover a distance that should have taken 2. We were the ones people called when they were thinking of going somewhere and wanted to know if it was worth it, because we had usually already been there. The Labor Day weekend hiking trip started in 1997. 8 of us at the beginning, Martin and me, 3 other couples from the neighborhood, 2 friends from my teaching years. By the time it ended, in the years after Martin died and after my knee, it had grown to 15 people with a rotating cast, different combinations each year, depending on schedules and health and the annual renegotiation of who was still in. 22 consecutive years, with the exception of 2020, when the pandemic made it impossible. 22 years of the same mountain, the same trailhead, the same dinner at the lodge on Sunday evening. It was the fixed point of my September. Martin died in October of 2017. He was 79. The hiking trip in September of 2017 was the last one he did, though we didn't know it would be. He was already not well, but not yet in the stage where things were clearly ending. And he made it to the top of the short trail and back, more slowly than in earlier years, and sat at the trailhead afterward with a look on his face that I have thought about many times since. Satisfied, present, the particular quality of someone doing something they love for a reason they can feel but cannot name. I went to the Labor Day trip in 2018 and 2019 without him. Both times I walked the longer trail alone for part of the day, and I found I could do it, that the grief of it was real, and that walking through the grief of it while walking the trail was its own kind of necessary. Both times I came home with something I wouldn't have had if I'd stayed behind. In April of 2021, I had a knee replacement. The surgery was necessary, and the recovery was longer and more difficult than I was told it would be, which is the ordinary experience of surgical recovery at 83. By the fall of 2021, I could walk without pain, which was the goal, but I could not hike. Not in the way the Labor Day trip required, not with the elevation and the uneven ground and the distances we had been doing for 2 decades. I knew this by September of 2021. I told Carol, who organized the trip each year, that I wouldn't be able to make it. She said she was sorry. She said they would miss me. She said, maybe next year. I heard nothing more about the 2021 trip until someone sent a group photo. Not an invitation, a photo. My neighbor Vera is 80 years old. She has lived across the street from me since 1989, 36 years, and in all that time, she has never been someone who went places or kept a fast pace or organized her life around shared activity. She is a quiet woman who moves through the world at her own unhurried speed, who has always had a small number of people she was genuinely close to, rather than a large number she was regularly active with. I used to watch Vera's quieter life from the middle of my own busier one, and feel, not unkindly, that she was missing something, that the fullness of a life was at least partly measured by its momentum. Vera's daughter visits on Wednesday evenings, her friend Ruth. They have known each other since their 30s, comes for lunch on Fridays without fail, in a way that has nothing to do with occasion or activity, and everything to do with simply being each other's person. These things have not changed in the years since Vera's life became quieter, because they were never contingent on Vera's life having any particular speed. The friendship was the thing from the beginning. The friendship never needed a trail. I did not understand this distinction until I was on the wrong side of it. I thought I did. I thought I understood the difference between friends who were friends and friends who were companions in activity. I did not understand it with the specificity that only lived experience provides. Vera never hiked a day in her life. I used to think of this as a small limitation. I understand now that it was a form of wisdom I had too much momentum to develop. After I saw the photograph on Janet's phone, I sat with what I was feeling for several weeks before I did anything about it. I have never been someone who moves quickly through emotional territory. I move quickly through physical territory, through plans and arrangements and the logistics of going places. But the interior work I do slowly. So I sat with it. What I felt in the first weeks was simple and straightforward. I had been left out of something that had been mine for 22 years without being told. And that hurt in the way being excluded always hurts, regardless of the reason. That part was not complicated. What came after the initial hurt was more complicated. I began to look at the shape of it, at why it had happened, at the logic that made sense from the other side. Carol had organized the trip every year. Carol was a kind person, a genuinely warm person, someone I had trusted and enjoyed for a long time. If I tried to inhabit her reasoning rather than my own injury, I could hear it. Dorothy can't hike. The trip is a hiking trip. Inviting her would be inviting her to something she can't do, which is unkind. So we didn't invite her. The reasoning was not malicious. The reasoning was, in its own way, considerate. And it also, without anyone in the room deciding to do so, effectively ended my membership in the group. I called Carol in October, not to confront her. I am 85 years old, and I have learned that confrontation is almost never the instrument that produces the understanding you're after. I called to talk, and eventually I mentioned the photograph, and eventually Carol said the thing I had expected her to say. "Dorothy, we didn't think you'd want to come, with your knee. We didn't want you to feel like you were being left behind on the trail." I thought about how to answer that for a moment, and then I said, "I have been coming on this trip for 22 years. I came after Martin died. I came when my hip was bad in 2014, and I walked the flat trail while everyone else did the long one, and I had dinner with everyone on Sunday evening, and that was enough. I know what I can and cannot do. I would have liked to be asked." Carol was quiet. Then she said she was sorry, and I believe she was, and we talked about other things. And I have seen Carol since then, and it has been fine, in the way things are fine, when something has been named and absorbed and is no longer the large, unaddressed thing in the room. But the trip went on in 2023 and 2024 without me. I was not asked. I think Carol believed she had made it right by saying she was sorry, and perhaps from her side of it she had. From mine, the question was whether the conversation had changed anything, and it had not. There was a second category, beyond the ones who simply disappeared, that I want to describe because I think it is in some ways harder to name than the disappearing. These were the friends who still called, who stayed in nominal contact, who had lunch with me occasionally, or invited me to things I could attend, dinners, exhibitions, events that didn't require the pace I could no longer keep. They were present, and I don't want to be ungrateful for the presence. But there was a quality to the contact that I began to notice and that I find difficult to describe fairly without sounding ungracious. It was the quality of being accommodated, of being the slower one, the one with limitations, the one whose circumstances now required adjustment. The conversations filled with their activities, the trip they'd just taken, the hike they were planning, the things they were doing that I was no longer doing. in a way that was not unkind, but that positioned me in the architecture of the friendship as the audience rather than the participant. They were living their lives and telling me about them. Before, we had been living similar lives and telling each other. I began to understand that what had held many of these friendships together was not affection. There was genuine affection, and I don't doubt that, but shared pace, shared momentum. We had moved through the world at the same speed for decades, and the shared speed had created a companionship so continuous and so unremarkable that I had mistaken it for something deeper than it was. When the speed diverged, the companionship had less to stand on than I had believed. In October of 2022, in the weeks after I saw the photograph, I joined a bird-watching group at the Nature Center 2 miles from my house. This was not something I would have done in my previous life. I had always been moving too quickly to stop and look at birds. The group met on Saturday mornings and walked slowly through the preserve for 2 hours, stopping frequently, which meant it was something I could do. I met a woman named Phyllis at the first meeting. She is 67, 18 years younger than me, which would have seemed like an odd gap before, and which now seems beside the point. She is a retired librarian who has always moved through the world at a considered pace, who told me on our first walk that she had never been someone who went fast at anything, and had made her peace with this a long time ago. She had never heard of me, did not know the hiking group, did not know Martin or the 22 years of Labor Day weekends. She knew the woman who walked carefully through the preserve on Saturday mornings and stopped to look at things. Phyllis calls me on Thursday evenings, not because anything is happening. Nothing is usually happening, because that is the evening she calls. We talk for 40 minutes or an hour about whatever is on our minds, and when we hang up, I feel the specific satisfaction of having been in actual contact with another person, rather than having been in the social management of a relationship that requires maintenance. One Thursday afternoon in the fall of 2023, I was sitting on the bench at the end of my street. I go there most afternoons now. It is a 15-minute walk from my house, which is the distance I can cover comfortably. And there is a good view of the intersection where the neighborhood changes character, and I find I can sit there for 40 minutes without wanting to be anywhere else. Phyllis joined me that afternoon. We sat together for an hour and watched the light change. We didn't have anywhere to go. There was nowhere we were supposed to be. I thought, I spent 60 years moving through the world so fast, I never actually stopped to be in it. And I could not have told you from inside the motion that anything was missing. Here is the thing I did not expect to find when I slowed down. The world became more present, not less. I do not mean this as consolation, as the thing you say to make a loss acceptable by pretending it wasn't a loss. The hiking was real, and the motion was real, and the Labor Day trips were 22 years of something genuine, and their ending is a loss. I am not pretending otherwise. What I mean is that the slower pace revealed something the faster pace had been covering. When you are always moving, The world comes at you in motion, a landscape seen from a moving vehicle, real but not stationary, not fully available to be looked at. When you slow down, the world stops moving too. You can see what's actually there. I have watched more sunsets in the past 3 years than in the preceding 30. Because I am on the bench at the end of the street in the late afternoon when the light does what it does, and I am not rushing past it on the way to somewhere else. I know the names of the birds that use the feeder in the backyard, which I would not have been able to tell you 5 years ago. I know my neighbor Agnes in a way I did not know her before, because I am no longer moving fast enough to wave from the car window. I am moving slowly enough to stop and talk. And we have been talking. And it turns out Agnes is a more interesting person than I understood when I was too busy going somewhere to find out. The friends who vanished were attached to a version of me that was real and that I valued. I am not saying they were wrong to be attached to her or shallow for not staying when she changed. The fast Dorothy was a real person. The hiking trips were real. The shared momentum of 2 decades was real in the way that shared experience is always real. But the fast Dorothy was also, I understand this now with the clarity the slowness gave me, a performance in one specific sense. She was always moving forward, always organizing the next thing, always so occupied with what was coming that she was never entirely in what was happening. The friendships formed around the fast Dorothy were formed around the doing, around the next trip and the plans and the shared competence of people who went places and did things. And doing friendships, I have learned, are durable only as long as the doing continues. Phyllis has never known the fast Dorothy. Phyllis knows the woman on the bench, the woman who walks carefully and stops to look at the heron standing motionless in the shallow water at the edge of the preserve. The woman who has an hour on a Thursday evening and nothing more urgent to do with it than talk. That Dorothy, the one I am now, is the only Dorothy Phyllis has ever met, and she calls every Thursday, and the calls are the kind of calls where nothing in particular happens and nothing needs to happen. I think about the people I know who are in their 50s and 60s, still moving fast, still organized around shared activity and shared pace, still building the social world that motion builds. I am not telling them to slow down. The motion has its own value and its own gifts, and there is nothing wrong with a life that goes places. What I am telling them is, look at the friendships underneath the activity. If you removed the hiking, the trips, the plans, the shared doing, what would be left? Who would call on a Thursday for no reason? Who knows the version of you that isn't going anywhere? Because that version will eventually exist for all of you. Age requires it. Health requires it. And the friendships you will need in that version are not the same as the friendships the fast version accumulated. And you cannot build them quickly. And you cannot build them from the doing alone. Build some friendships now around the being rather than the doing. Sit with someone without a plan. Call someone not to organize something, but to talk. Allow yourself to be known at a pace that doesn't require anything of either of you except presence. Those friendships are the ones that survive the slowdown. And the slowdown, I can promise you, will come. And when it does, you will want to have already built the thing that doesn't need speed to hold together. Tell me in the comments, if you remove the shared activities from your closest friendships, the trips, the plans, the things you do together, what would remain? Who knows you at a standstill? I spent 60 years going places, and I am 85 years old, and I can tell you the answer to that question now with more precision than I would ever have wished for. Count the ones who would stay, and then go call one of them right now for no reason at all.